The stars above the outer spiral arm had not been peaceful in 2 centuries. Where once trade routes hummed with merchant vessels and diplomatic couriers, now only warships traveled bristling with weapons, scarred from battles that had long since blurred together into one endless, grinding nightmare. The Vorkai Dominion and the Thessari Collective had been locked in a war so old that neither side could name a soldier who had been alive when it began. Commanders studied battles their great-grandparents had fought. Children were born into uniforms. Entire generations lived and died, never knowing a sky that wasn't threatened. The Vorkai were a tall, sharp-boned species, angular and precise, built by evolution for cold calculation. They fought like mathematicians, efficient, merciless, strategic. Their ships were dark and angular, designed to absorb sensor signals and emerge from the black like sudden nightmares. They believed, genuinely and deeply, that the universe rewarded the strong and erased the weak. 200 years of war had only confirmed that belief. The Thessari were something different entirely, broad-shouldered, bioluminescent beings whose skin shifted color with emotion. In peacetime, historians said, a Thessari city looked like a living aurora. In wartime, their colors had gone mostly dark. They fought with fury and coordinated ferocity, driven by a cultural memory of a Vorkai atrocity so ancient that no living Thessari had witnessed it. Yet every child could recite the details before they could read. Grief, weaponized across centuries, kept the war burning when logic would have long since let it die. Between them lay the contested corridor, a sprawling region of 43 inhabited systems, dozens of resource-rich asteroid fields, and hundreds of billions of souls caught in the crossfire. Some of those systems had changed hands so many times that their populations no longer identified with either side. They simply survived, season to season, hopping the next fleet that passed overhead would not decide their world was strategically valuable today. The wider galaxy had tried to intervene. The Murath Confederation sent diplomats twice. The first delegation was destroyed when they arrived during a surprise Vorkai offensive and were caught in the crossfire. The second was turned away by both sides simultaneously, which diplomatic historians would later note was the only thing the Vorkai and Thessari had ever agreed on. The Sorvani Collective issued 17 formal resolutions calling for ceasefire. All 17 were ignored. The hegemony of the 5 worlds considered military intervention, ran the numbers, decided the casualties weren't worth it, and quietly closed their borders. The galaxy in the end looked away. And the war continued, grinding, consuming, eternal. On the Vorkai flagship calculating Dominion, Admiral Krethsaron stood before a holographic display of the current front lines and felt something he rarely allowed himself to feel: frustration. Not at the Thessari. He had long since stopped thinking of them as individuals and saw them only as variables in an equation. His frustration was mathematical. The war had reached what his analysts called a terminal equilibrium, both sides capable of inflicting enormous damage, neither capable of delivering a decisive blow. They were two ancient fighters, arms locked, grinding each other down to nothing, unable to fall and unable to win. He was reviewing a proposal for a new offensive one that would require the sacrifice of approximately 40,000 Vorkai soldiers for a projected gain of 2 star systems, when his communications officer interrupted with an expression he had never seen on a Vorkai face before. Confusion. "Admiral," the officer said carefully, "we are receiving a transmission. It is, not from the Thessari." Krethsaron turned slowly. "Origin." "That is the problem, sir." The officer pulled up a trajectory map. "It originates from deep in the galactic interior, a region we have classified as uninhabited, a species we have on record only as a footnote pre-contact civilization, largely ignored. They call themselves," he paused as if the word felt strange in his mouth, "humans." The admiral stared at the map. The signal point was absurdly far from the front lines, a small, unremarkable star system in a quiet arm of the galaxy that no serious power had ever bothered to claim. "What does the transmission say?" The officer read it aloud. Short, blunt, delivered in perfect Vorkai standard dialect, as if whoever sent it had been practicing the language for a very long time. "We are coming, stop the war. This is your only notification." Kreth looked at the message for a long moment. Then he laughed, a short, sharp sound rare from him. "File it," he said, and returned to his offensive proposal. 40 light-years away, the Thessari High Command received the same message. Their reaction was quieter. A few officers exchanged glances. One suggested sending a polite response declining the offer. Another pointed out that no one had asked the humans for an offer in the first place. The message was archived, forgotten within the hour. Neither side gave it another thought. That was their first mistake. The Thessari scout vessel Brightwake was running a standard patrol sweep along the outer edge of the contested corridor when its long-range sensor array threw an alert that the crew initially assumed was a malfunction. Lieutenant Siravas, the ship's sensor operator, tapped the console twice, the universal gesture of "you must be wrong," and watched the reading reappear. She recalibrated. She ran a diagnostic. She called in the ship's engineer, who ran another diagnostic. The reading remained. The engineer's skin flickered pale yellow, involuntary, the color of disbelief. "That can't be right." What the sensors were showing was a mass transit signature. Not unusual in a Warzone, ships moved constantly. What was unusual was the scale. The signature was so enormous, so geometrically vast, that the Brightwake's computer had initially classified it as a rogue stellar object, a brown dwarf perhaps, drifting unexpectedly into the system. But brown dwarfs didn't move in formation. Lieutenant Siravas counted the individual signatures. She stopped at 100 and restarted, convinced she was double counting. She stopped again at 500, then again at 1,000. She called the captain. Captain Dorenhale arrived on the bridge, looked at the display, and stood very still for a moment that stretched uncomfortably long. "SCI-FI," she asked, referring to the identification friend or foe signal every Allied ship broadcast. "None," Siravas said. "Vorkai." "No, Captain." "Then who?" The Brightwake's comm system lit up across every frequency simultaneously, not a targeted transmission, but a broadcast so broad and powerful it was like being shouted at by a star. The voice that came through was calm, almost conversational, speaking in Thessari standard with an accent that was difficult to place, not quite right, like someone who had learned the language from recordings rather than from living speakers. "Attention all vessels in the contested corridor. This is the United Earth Armada, representing the unified governments and peoples of the human species. We are entering this region with the purpose of establishing an immediate and permanent cessation of hostilities between the Vorkai Dominion and the Thessari Collective. We are not here as combatants. We ask that all vessels stand down and hold their current positions. We will not repeat this request." Captain Dorenhale stared at the comm panel. Then she looked back at the sensor display, where the mass signatures were continuing to resolve sharper now, as the unknown fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel in a cascade that lasted nearly 20 minutes. 20 minutes. The arrival sequence alone took 20 minutes because there were so many of them. When the display finally settled, the Brightwake's computer had counted 4,312 individual vessels. They ranged in size from fast-moving scouts, smaller than anything the Thessari fielded, to something the computer simply labeled as unknown class, capital, estimated mass, EXCEDS database, PARAMETRS. There were 6 of those. 6 ships so large that they registered on sensors the way moons registered on sensors. The captain opened a channel to Thessari Command. Her voice, she was proud to note, remained steady. "Command, this is Brightwake. You need to see what we're seeing, right now." She transmitted the sensor data and waited. The response took longer than normal. When it came, it was from an admiral rather than the usual duty officer, which told her that command had seen the data and immediately understood that this was not a routine situation. "Bright Wake," the Admiral said, "are your sensors functioning correctly?" "Yes, sir. 3 independent diagnostics." A pause. "And they're just sitting there?" "Yes, sir, holding position at the corridor entrance, not advancing, not powering weapons that we can detect." She hesitated. "Sir, they sent the transmission in Thessari Standard, perfect grammar. They know who we are." Another pause, longer this time. Then the scouts along the Vorkai side of the corridor began reporting in as well, flooding command channels on both sides simultaneously, because the human armada had not arrived at one edge of the war zone. It had arrived at all of them. Every entrance, every approach vector, every corridor and choke point and back route that either side's strategists had mapped over 2 centuries of war, every single one was now occupied by human vessels, sitting quietly, broadcasting their ceasefire frequency on every channel, patient and immovable as a mountain range that had simply decided to exist in a new location. Someone, somewhere, had mapped every inch of this war zone before they arrived. And they had brought enough ships to cover all of it. Admiral Kreth-Saron of the Vorkai Dominion was not accustomed to feeling small. He had commanded fleets. He had taken systems. He had looked at star maps and seen them as problems to be solved, and he had solved them with the cold, methodical efficiency that had made him one of the most feared military minds in the outer spiral. He did not frighten easily, and he did not rattle at all. He was rattled now. Not by the size of the human fleet, though the size was, objectively, staggering. Not by the audacity of their positioning, though placing yourself between 2 active warring fleets without raising a shield was either the bravest thing he had ever witnessed or the most catastrophic miscalculation in military history. He was rattled by the calm of them. They just sat there. Kreth-Saron ordered a targeting lock on the nearest human formation, a cluster of mid-sized vessels holding position across what should have been his primary offensive lane. The lock confirmed. Fire solutions calculated. He gave the order to open fire, half expecting the humans to scatter, to reveal this entire display as a bluff, a political gesture, a show of bravado that would collapse the moment real weapons powered up. The Vorkai batteries fired. The energy weapons crossed the distance in seconds and struck the lead human vessel dead center. Kreth-Saron watched the impact readouts. He waited for the hull breach alerts, the atmosphere venting, the secondary explosions. The energy dispersed. Not reflected would have meant shields, and he would have seen the shield signature. Not absorbed, absorption generated heat, and there was no thermal bloom. The weapons fire simply came apart against the hull like water thrown against warm sand, spreading and vanishing and leaving nothing behind. The human vessel did not move. It did not respond aggressively. Its running lights didn't even flicker. Kreth-Saron's tactical officer looked at him with an expression that, on a Vorkai face, was the equivalent of pure bewilderment. "Admiral, their hull is, sir, I don't know what their hull is made of." The comm panel lit up, a direct channel request from the human flagship. The Admiral stared at it for a moment, then accepted. The voice was female, unhurried and faintly amused, not mockingly so, but in the way of someone who expected exactly what had just happened and had simply been waiting for it to be over. "Admiral Kreth-Saron, we understand you needed to test that. We're not offended, but I'd like to speak with you now if you're finished." His title, his name, perfectly pronounced. "Who is this?" he demanded. "Admiral Yara Osai, United Earth Armada commanding. I think you'll find your offensive lanes are currently unavailable. I'd like to offer you an alternative." Simultaneously, across the war zone, human vessels were having similar conversations. Thessari batteries had fired on 3 separate human formations. The results were identical: weapons dispersion, no damage, no retaliation. Confused Thessari gunnery crews reported back to their commanders that it felt less like attacking an enemy and more like attacking a geography. You could hit it as much as you wanted. It simply didn't care. But it wasn't the invulnerability that was breaking people. It was the patience. Human vessels didn't maneuver aggressively. They didn't posture. They didn't broadcast threats or demand surrender or move to encircle vulnerable targets. They simply remained where they were, quiet and steady, broadcasting their ceasefire frequency in an endless loop, in Vorkai Standard, in Thessari Common Tongue, in 17 other languages that covered every species within communication range. Junior officers on both sides found themselves in the strange position of having nothing to shoot at that would shoot back, nothing to chase that would run, and nothing to threaten that appeared to feel threatened. War, it turned out, required a certain kind of participation from the enemy. The humans were declining to participate. A young Vorkai weapons officer, named Teth, quietly asked his senior what they were supposed to do now. The senior officer looked at the display for a long moment. "I genuinely don't know," he admitted. It was, in its own way, the most honest thing said on either side in 200 years. On the Thessari command ship, Fleet Admiral Vasreen, a veteran of 60 years of continuous warfare who had survived more battles than most soldiers ever saw, pulled up the human fleet's approach trajectory and ran the analysis backward. He wanted to understand when they had left their home system. When he got the answer, he sat very still. The human Armada had departed from their home system 18 years ago. They had spent 18 years in transit, crossing the galaxy to come here. That meant they had decided to do this, had built for this, had planned for this, at least 2 decades before today, possibly much longer. Vasreen thought about that for a long time. Then he opened a channel to the human flagship, and for the first time in his long career, spoke to an enemy without his hand near a weapon. The emergency intelligence briefing aboard the Vorkai flagship ran for 6 hours. It was, by any measure, an embarrassing 6 hours. The Dominion's intelligence apparatus, widely considered one of the most sophisticated in the known galaxy, had a file on humanity that was, when printed in full, 31 pages long. For context, their file on a minor trading consortium operating out of the Murath border worlds ran to over 400 pages. Humanity, tucked away in a quiet corner of the galactic interior, had simply never seemed worth the attention. They had been classified as pre-contact, low threat, low resource, low priority, and largely forgotten. The 31 pages contained the following: a physical description of the species, a note that they were carbon-based and bipedal, an inventory of their home system that was outdated by at least 60 years, and a single sentence that read, and the intelligence officer's voice was noticeably strained as he read it aloud. Species demonstrates unusual capacity for internal conflict, long-term survival prospects uncertain. The surviving prospects had, it seemed, turned out fine. What had happened in the decades the Dominion wasn't watching was now being assembled in real time from intercepted human communications, publicly broadcast historical data that the humans apparently saw no reason to conceal, and a series of direct exchanges that human officers were, bizarrely, volunteering without being asked, as if they wanted the Vorkai to know, as if they had been waiting for someone to ask. The picture that assembled itself was this. Approximately 300 years ago, humanity had been in a condition that politely might be called chaotic. They were divided into hundreds of separate nation-states with competing ideologies, multiple active wars, significant resource inequality, and what their own historians cheerfully described as a near-complete failure to act collectively on any issue of planetary importance. Several separate analyses from that era had concluded that human civilization would collapse under its own contradictions within a century. It did not collapse. Instead, and this was the part where the Vorkai intelligence officers kept exchanging glances, it reorganized. Not through conquest, not through the dominance of one faction over all others, but through a grinding, painful, argument-filled process of negotiation that had taken nearly 100 years and produced a unified planetary government that, by all accounts, no one was entirely happy with, but that everyone could live with. The humans themselves described it as the worst possible outcome except for all the others. After unification came acceleration. Medical technology that had lagged behind the rest of the known galaxy was solved, largely within 2 generations. Not through some miraculous discovery, but through massive coordinated research programs. Human lifespan doubled, then stretched further. Genetic diseases were eliminated. Biological modifications, initially controversial, became normalized. Humans had been quietly editing their own species for a century and a half, not for superiority, they insisted, but for durability. Space colonization, previously stumbling, became systematic. The humans built what they called generation ships, vessels designed not to reach their destinations within a single lifetime, but within several. They sent families on journeys knowing the grandchildren of the passengers would be the ones to arrive, and those families went, willingly, enthusiastically. As if the prospect of a 100-year voyage in a metal shell through empty space was simply another thing humans were prepared to endure if the destination was worth it. And through all of this, through the unification and the medicine and the colonization and the quiet, steady expansion, they had been watching the war. That was the detail that landed hardest. A Vorkai general named Vethkal reviewed the human communications records and found logs, public logs, indexed and archived, available to anyone of human civilian observers commenting on the war. Not politicians, not military analysts, civilians, people who followed the conflict the way other species followed weather systems or stellar phenomena, who named the battles, who built memorials on their homeworld for civilizations that didn't know they existed, who argued in public forums that went back over a century about what someone should do. And then, apparently, they decided that someone was them. Vethkal closed the file and sat in silence for a long time. They watched us, he finally said. For 200 years they watched us and they remembered everything. The intelligence officer nodded. And then they built a fleet and came to make us stop, Vethkal continued. His voice was strange, not angry, not contemptuous, something that a Vorkai general had very little practice identifying. They are not a great power, they are not ancient, they are not even particularly well known. He looked at the display. So why does this feel like being caught by something much older than us? No one in the room had an answer. The invitation to board the UEAS Endurance arrived on both flagships simultaneously, phrased not as a demand but as a request. And the careful, deliberate courtesy of it was somehow more unsettling than an ultimatum would have been. We would be honored if you would join us aboard our flagship. There is something we would like to show you before we discuss terms. No weapons, no guards beyond your personal detail. You have our word on your safety, and we understand if that means little yet. We are prepared to earn it. The Vorkai delegation arrived first, Admiral Krethsaron himself, flanked by 2 aides who kept their hands conspicuously visible, as instructed. The docking bay was immense, easily large enough to hold a Vorkai patrol craft inside, which struck Krethsaron as deliberate, the architecture of a species that built everything a size larger than necessary, as if preparing for contingencies. Human crew members received them, tall, varied bipedal creatures in dark uniforms who were, Krethsaron noticed, genuinely and visibly curious about him. Not professionally neutral, not diplomatically polite. Curious. They looked at him the way he might look at an unfamiliar star formation, interested, attentive, cataloging. A human officer, young, with warm brown skin and steady eyes, introduced herself as Commander Adisa and offered to escort them. She led them not to a conference room, not to command center, but down a long corridor that Krethsaron gradually realized was not a corridor at all. It was a hall. It extended further than should have been architecturally possible for the section of the ship they appeared to be in, and Krethsaron's mind briefly recalculated the Endurance's interior dimensions before understanding. This space had been built for this, deliberately included in the design. prioritized in a warship the way a warship should never prioritize anything that wasn't weapons or engines. The walls were covered in names. Millions of names. On both sides, floor to ceiling, every surface, inscribed in a material that caught light slowly so that as you moved through the hall the names seemed to shift and shimmer, alive and unquiet. Names in Vorkai script, names in Thessari script, names in dozens of other languages representing the billions of civilian dead caught in the contested corridor over 200 years. Every name the humans had been able to find, compiled from records, from survivor testimony, from the broadcasts of burning stations and the manifests of ships that never arrived. Krethsaran walked slowly. He had lived with the war his entire life. He knew the statistics. He could recite casualty figures to 3 decimal points. Numbers, clean, orderly numbers that fit into equations and produced outcomes. He had never thought of them as names. The hall took 40 minutes to walk at a slow pace. At the center, beneath a light source that illuminated nothing except a circular space just large enough to stand in, Admiral Yara Osai was waiting. She was shorter than Krethsaran had imagined, smaller than her voice suggested. A human in middle age, with close-cropped gray hair and the particular stillness of someone who had learned to be very quiet in very loud rooms. She wore no decorations, no medals, just the uniform and the rank. She looked at Krethsaran without triumph, without aggression, without the faint theatrical performance of a general receiving a defeated enemy. She looked at him the way the hall around them looked, patient, accumulated, heavy with something that didn't need to announce itself. "I didn't bring you here to shame you," she said. Her Vorkai was precise, unhurried. "I'm not interested in shame. Shame is about the past. I'm interested in what happens next." Krethsaran looked around the hall. His voice, when it came, was quieter than he intended. "How?" he asked, meaning the names, the scale, the years of effort, the fact that anyone had cared enough. Osai considered the question seriously. "We lost people we loved in stupid conflicts," she said. "For centuries we did. We learned slowly, badly, with enormous cost that the only way to make the dead mean something was to make sure they were the last ones." She paused. "So we count. We always count." The Thessari delegation arrived an hour later. Fleet Admiral Vasreen walked the hall more slowly than Krethsaran had. His bioluminescent skin cycled through colors slowly, grief blue, then memory silver, then a deep, exhausted amber that his junior officers had only ever seen on the very old and the very tired. When he reached the center and saw Osai, he could not speak. She waited. The Thessari wept in silence, not weakness, but what their culture had always meant by it. The moment when experience finally exceeded the capacity of language. He stood in the Hall of Names and wept for a long time, and no human in the room made any move to rush him. When he finally gathered himself, he asked her one question. "Did you count hours too?" Osai nodded. He looked at the walls around him, at the Thessari names among all the others, not separated, not ranked, not diminished. "No one has ever counted hours," he said. "We know," she said. "We thought someone should." The ceasefire was not signed that day. Both sides returned to their ships, and within hours the political machinery of 2 centuries of war ground back into motion. Generals filed reports. Governments issued statements. The Vorkai High Command sent a terse communique pointing out that the human Armada's positioning constituted an act of aggression under 17 separate provisions of interstellar law. The Thessari Council issued a declaration that they would not negotiate under duress, and that the human intervention was an unacceptable violation of their sovereign right to wage war. It was, Admiral Osai noted to her staff, completely expected. "They need to feel like they're choosing it," she said. "You can't give people peace. You can only make the alternative persistently, patiently, completely unavailable." What followed was 72 hours that the military analysts of 3 civilizations would later spend decades arguing over. The Vorkai attempted 6 separate offensive maneuvers. Not against the humans, they had tested that and understood the result. Against the Thessari through routes that should have been open. Each time they found a human vessel already in position. Not recently moved, already there, as if it had been waiting. The routes closed without confrontation, without weapons fire, without a single human transmission. The ships were simply there, immovable, patient, reading as neutral on every targeting system. The Thessari attempted 3 flanking operations through the outer asteroid fields, complex maneuvers that took days to coordinate and relied on stealth approach vectors that had taken their tacticians years to map. Human vessels were present at all 3, waiting. A Thessari tactical analyst named Vorashan ran the numbers twice before she trusted them. The human Armada's positioning wasn't reactive. It wasn't responding to Thessari movements. It had predicted them. The fleet had been placed based on projections, battle simulations, probability modeling, deep analysis of 2 centuries of tactical patterns that must have been running for decades before the Armada even departed human space. She pulled the oldest available records of human communications regarding the war. She searched for the earliest reference to military planning. She found it. 63 years ago. A classified human government document that had apparently been declassified and publicly archived 18 years prior, right around the time the Armada departed. The document's title was dry and bureaucratic, Projected Resolution Timeline, Outer Spiral Conflict. It contained 63 years of tactical analysis. It contained fleet composition recommendations. It contained a list of every significant choke point in the contested corridor, mapped with precision that suggested the humans had been running surveillance on this war zone for longer than the document itself was old. And on the final page, a note in plain, unadorned language. This operation will require patience above all other qualities. The goal is not victory. The goal is the permanent removal of the option to continue. Vorashan sat with the document for a long time. Then she did something unusual for a military analyst. She went to find the ship's historian. "Tell me about humans," she said. "Not the fleet, the species. What are they known for?" The historian, an elderly Thessari who had studied non-collective civilizations for 50 years, thought for a moment. "Stubbornness," he said. "An unusual capacity for long-term thinking combined with short-term emotional volatility. They are by most accounts the only species in the known galaxy that makes both excellent diplomats and excellent soldiers, not because they are the strongest or the most intelligent, but because they refuse to stop." He paused. "There is a word in their primary language, persistence. Other species have the concept. Humans seem to have built a civilization around it." Vorashan looked out at the human vessels, holding their positions in the dark. "They've been working on this for 60 years, she said quietly. "Longer, probably," the historian said. "Humans like to be ready before they begin." On the Vorkai side, a similar reckoning was happening in quieter, more controlled voices. General Vethkal had been running his own analysis, focused not on the tactical positioning but on the logistics. Feeding, fueling, and maintaining a fleet of 4,000 ships over an 18-year transit required supply chains of staggering complexity. He mapped the human colony systems that must have served as waypoints, refueling stations, resupply depots, maintenance facilities, all of them built specifically for this operation and placed along the route decades before the fleet departed. An entire interstellar infrastructure, built in silence, for this single purpose. "They didn't decide to do this," he told Kreth-Saron. "They decided to do this, and then they spent decades making sure they could." Kreth-Saron stood at his viewport, looking at the human ships. "Who are these people?" he said, not to Vethkal, not to anyone in the room, just aloud, to the dark. "It began with food. Not diplomacy, not negotiations. Not any of the formal mechanisms that political officers on both sides were still furiously attempting to initiate through proper channels. It began because a human crew member on a mid-sized patrol vessel called the UEAS Meridian noticed a Vorkai scout ship holding position nearby. as it had been for 3 days, and could see through their own sensor feeds that the Vorkai vessel's power consumption had dropped in a pattern consistent with rationing. They were running low on supplies. The Meridian's crew chief, a compact, energetic woman named Sergeant Kofi Asant Mensa, made a decision that was not in any operational order. She loaded a cargo container with preserved rations and thermal packs, attached a simple message in Vorkai Standard: "We thought you might need this. No obligation," and had it delivered via drone to the Vorkai ship's docking port. There was a long silence from the Vorkai vessel. Then, after nearly 4 hours, a single Vorkai crew member cycled through the airlock, retrieved the container, and sent back a one-line transmission. "Acknowledged, thank you." Word spread the way small strange things spread through militaries with nothing to do and nowhere to go. Within 18 hours, human crews along the line were making similar gestures, and Vorkai and Thessari crews, baffled and wrong-footed, were accepting them with the awkward grace of people who have been trained their entire lives for confrontation and have no protocol for kindness from a stranger. And then came the conversations. They were small at first: technical exchanges, comparative observations about ship design, a human engineer asking a Vorkai counterpart about a propulsion system configuration he'd spotted on their sensor feeds, then longer, then harder. A human signals officer named Ensign Tamaz Reyes, 23 years old, 2 years out of the academy, who had volunteered for the Armada because his grandfather had followed the war his entire life and died never seeing it end, struck up a running dialogue with a Thessari communications officer across the line. They talked for 6 hours the first night, about their ships, about their families, about how long they had each been deployed. Then the Thessari officer asked, hesitantly, what humans knew about the war. Reyes pulled up the public archive. He started sending files. The Thessari officer had never seen Vorkai civilian casualty figures. Not the combat deaths, everyone knew those broadly. The civilian deaths, the worlds depopulated. The colony ships that had been destroyed in transit, not because they were military targets but because they were there. He had grown up knowing that the Vorkai were the enemy, ancient, absolute, unquestionable, and he had never, not once in his life, thought of them as a population that also mourned. He sat with the files for a long time. Then he asked Reyes for more. Across the line, similar exchanges were spreading. Vorkai soldiers receiving Thessari casualty records for the first time, learning about cities they had never been told existed, about a Thessari colony, a peaceful research station, 3,000 inhabitants that had been destroyed in a Vorkai raid 40 years ago, classified as a military installation in Vorkai records and never corrected. 3,000 people who had become a footnote in a report that said military installation neutralized. A Vorkai soldier who had been on that raid, one of the bombardment crew, now senior and decorated, read the file alone in his quarters. His junior officer found him there 2 hours later, very still, looking at the names. The soldier didn't say anything. He just handed her the file. She read it. She looked at the names. She thought about the medal she had seen pinned to his uniform. Neither of them spoke for a long time. And across the war zone, in hundreds of small moments like this one, something was quietly happening that no ceasefire agreement and no political document could ever manufacture. The war was becoming real to the people fighting it, in a way that 2 centuries of propaganda had carefully prevented. Not an equation, not a score, not a historical grievance refracted through so many retellings that no one remembered the original injury anymore. People who had died, who had been alive, who had names. The human armada said almost nothing during this period. They held their positions. They kept the offensive lanes blocked. They broadcast their ceasefire frequency. They offered food and company and, most powerfully, their records. 200 years of records, offered freely to anyone who asked. On the Vorkai flagship, Admiral Krethsaron received a report from his morale officers. Discipline was holding, but there was something happening in the ranks that they had no category for, a kind of collective, spreading doubt. Not cowardice, Not defeatism, just a quiet, growing inability to remember clearly why the next battle needed to happen. He read the report twice. Then he did something he had never done in his career. He went to the mess hall and sat with his crew. And he listened. The ceasefire agreement was signed aboard the UEAS Endurance on the 78th hour. It was not a grand ceremony. There was no theater in it, no towering hall, no broadcast to the galaxy, no speeches delivered to banks of cameras. Admiral Osai had been specific about that. A small room, a table, the documents drafted in 3 languages simultaneously, placed in front of 3 parties who had never sat at the same table before. Krethsaron signed for the Vorkai Dominion. His hand was steady. Vosreen signed for the Thessari Collective. His bioluminescence shifted slowly to a color his junior officers had never seen. A soft, pale silver that their cultural lexicon listed under relief, so profound it resembles grief. Osai signed last. She did not celebrate. She did not smile in the way of someone who has won something. She signed with the careful attention of someone completing a very long task that was only the beginning of a longer one. The room was quiet for a moment after, the particular quiet of an absence. 200 years of noise, suddenly not there. Vosreen broke it. "When will your fleet depart?" he asked. The question was practical, logistical. When would the corridors open? When would normal movement resume? But there was something underneath it that was not entirely practical. Something that sounded, if you listened for it, like, "Please don't leave yet." Osai looked at him steadily. "We're not leaving," she said. The room shifted. "The ceasefire is signed," Krethsaron said carefully. "The stated objective was to end the fighting," Osai said. "Yes, and it's ended for now. We know better than most what happens to peace when it doesn't have memory." She stood, moving to the viewport that looked out across the contested corridor. 43 systems, scarred and quiet, beginning their first real silence in 2 centuries. "We've been through this, our species. We have signed our own ceasefires and watched them become the foundations of the next war and the war after that. We know the pattern." She turned back to them. "Peace without witnesses becomes permission," she said. "So we'll stay. Not as occupiers, not as administrators. We have no interest in your territory, your politics, or your internal governance. We will not interfere in how you rebuild or how you structure your societies. That's yours." She paused. "But we will remain here in this corridor, present, watching, remembering." Her voice was quiet but carried the weight of the hall of names that waited in the lower decks of her ship. Any movement toward resumed hostilities, any significant military buildup, any cross-border aggression, any action that looks like preparation for what we just ended, we will be here, and we will place ourselves between it. Krethsaron considered this for a long moment. "For how long?" he asked. Oz looked back out at the stars, at the quiet dark, at the hulls of human ships spread across the corridor like a constellation that had rearranged itself into something purposeful. "Long enough," she said. In the weeks that followed, both civilizations began the strange, disorienting work of learning what they were without a war to define them. It was harder than either expected. The Vorkai found that their economy, their culture, their social structure had been optimized so completely around military production that peace felt like losing a language. The Thessari discovered that their grief, their ancient, sacred, weapons-grade grief, had no target anymore. And turning it toward healing was a process that brought its own complicated pain. The human Armada remained. Their ships took up permanent positions across the corridor, their hulls eventually becoming familiar, expected landmarks in the space between 2 civilizations learning to be neighbors. Human crew members rotated home and were replaced by new ones, born after the Armada's departure, raised knowing this posting as simply where you went when you served. Children in Vorkai border cities began to recognize the shape of human vessels in the sky above them and felt not threat, but something closer to reassurance. The same reassurance, perhaps, that any population feels when they know someone is watching, that they are not invisible, that what happens to them will be remembered. On a Thessari colony world that had been changed hands 11 times in 200 years, a scarred, stubborn little planet that had survived everything thrown at it. A young teacher brought her students outside to watch a human patrol vessel pass slowly overhead. It was a small ship, its hull marked with the small scratches and repairs of long service, its running lights steady in the afternoon sky. One of the children asked what it was. "It's a human ship," the teacher said. "What are they doing?" She thought about it for a moment, about the Hall of Names she had seen in a broadcast, about the ceasefire, about 60 years of planning and 18 years of travel and 78 hours of patience against 2 centuries of war. "Watching," she said, "they're watching over us." The child considered this seriously, the way children consider things they are deciding whether to believe. Then she looked back up at the ship until it passed beyond the horizon, carrying its quiet purpose with it into the dark. And in the deep of the contested corridor, the human armada held its position, 4,000 ships, burning steady, patient as stone, enduring as the species that had built them. Not a weapon. A promise,